So at this point, Mordecai has been saved from Haman, but who still needs to be saved at this point? The rest of the Jewish population, because the decree to exterminate all the Jews still exists. So that's where we pick up in Esther chapter 8. Verse 1, on that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. You know, sometimes when we think that people don't get their just rewards in the end. In this case, Mordecai got exactly what he deserved, and Haman got exactly what he deserved. And we said last week when we ended that if we didn't believe that there was a God, that we could just say that this was quite ironic the way that things happened. But what's one of the things that we've seen all throughout the book of Esther? That God has had a plan since the beginning, but it is just on his timeline, just not ours. Just not Mordecai's, just not Esther's. But one thing I want to come back to real quick is a couple of weeks ago we said when Mordecai went to Esther, you know, maybe you've been put in place for such time as this, then there's that. But God will still accomplish what he needs to accomplish, even if you don't do it. But Esther decided, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to. In verse 3, then Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet, begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman, the Agagite, against the Jews. Again, the king held out his gold scepter to Esther. So she rose and stood before him. Because king had gone away at this point, so once again for Esther to go back before the king, if she was not invited, she had to hope that he held out his scepter, because if not, it's one of those off with their head type things. Verse 5, Esther said, if it pleases the king and I have found favor with him, and if he thinks it is right, and I like this part, and if I am pleasing to him. It's not just, hey, king, you know, if this is right, but I almost see this as you chose me to be the most beautiful. I'm going to bat my eyelashes a little bit. But you know, we're going to start with, you know this is the right thing to do. Let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, who ordered the Jews throughout all the king's provinces should be destroyed. For how can I endure to see my people and my family slaughtered and destroyed? If we think about the progression that Esther has gone through at this point, the first time she went to the king, what did she just ask? She said, I want you to come to a banquet. Second time, he's like, now what do you really want? She said, come back for another banquet and then I'll tell you. And this time she is going fully before the king, saying exactly what she wants to say. And so we see this progression in her life of a little bit nervous, still a little bit nervous, but I mean now she's like direct, king, here's what I want. Because why? At this point, this first part of the plan to kill Mordecai has been revealed. Mordecai's been saved. But Esther knows it's still not done yet, because at this point, what still exists? The execution order. Verse 7, then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. That's a lot of power right there. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring cannot be revoked. So let's pause right here for a second. So we opened with chapter 1 of Esther saying, once the king has made something law, could it be overturned? No. But what can happen? You can write a new law that's not going against the other law, but it kind of loopholes a little bit to allow some things. So that's what's about to happen. So on June 25th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and the decree was written exactly as Mordecai dictated. It was sent to the Jews and to the highest officers, the governors, and the nobles of all 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. The decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the peoples of the empire, including that of the Jews. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king's service. So not only was this decree about to go out, it was about to be speedy delivery. And here's the decree. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and take the property of their enemies. The day chosen for this event throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes was March 7th of the next year. Let's pause. So originally, the original decree by Haman was that anybody was allowed to kill all the Jews, and anybody that you killed, you got to take their property. And according to the law, the Jews were supposed to just what? Do nothing. Now, when we've talked about this before, for the Jews, this was going to be scary enough. But could you imagine being them, getting this decree, and essentially being told that you're just supposed to sit there and take it? Now, for us as good red-blooded Americans, if somebody told us to just sit there and take it, what do we have flags that say? Come and take it. We have flags that say, And if somebody ever tried to come against the South, there's more firearms in the South than probably all the northern states combined. There's probably more guns in Texas singly than the rest of the United States combined. And some of you probably have the majority of those in this room. I've seen some of your collections. But this law that Mordecai wrote that was being dispatched with the king's signet ring, which meant that it was now law, enabled the Jews to what? Defend themselves. Now, normally I try not to go too political, but I'm going to say this with what's going on in Israel today. The nation of Israel has every single right to defend itself, regardless of what politicians in America think. There's my political statement. Why? It almost goes back to this whole idea that I was taught as a child. Don't start something if you can't finish it. I got this question. I'm going to go down this little bunny trail a minute. Is war good and just? Somebody asked me this according to the Bible a couple weeks ago, and I was like, oh, that's a deep question. War is never good, but according to the Bible, it is just. War is not murder, but it is just. Now, we can get into the whole, well, who starts at that whole thing? But if you are trying to defend yourself, it is just according to the Bible. It's almost how Texas has a stand your ground state. Now, if somebody comes up against you and you need to defend yourself, you can do that according to state law of Texas. Other not so blessed states in the United States don't have that luxury because one reason I'm forever going to try to stay in Texas, even though I married somebody from Arkansas. Texas has the better laws. Texas is Texas. You can't beat it. But circling all the way back around to the original law, the Jews couldn't do anything. They were just supposed to let somebody come in there and kill them. But according to this law, the Jews could now stand their ground. Getting back to this, verse 11. And the Jews are going to be allowed to take the property of their enemies. So it completely flip-flopped. First law, you kill a Jew, you keep their stuff. New law, Jews, you can defend yourself, and if somebody comes after you and you kill them, then you get to keep their stuff. Let's jump down to verse 15. Then Mordecai left the king's presence wearing the royal robe of blue and white, the great crown of gold and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree. You know, sometimes when we read the Bible, we often read through things really quick and we don't notice things. But one of the things that's here in this last sentence is the people of Susa rejoiced. It wasn't just that the Jews in Susa rejoiced, but that everybody rejoiced. Because we said a couple of weeks ago, you know, the Jews weren't necessarily loved, but by a lot of people they were liked. And so the people who chose to stay in Susa and not go back to Jerusalem, a lot of times were well employed by the people in Susa. They worked for them, they liked them. But overall, the people were okay. Verse 16, the Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. So they went from being a little bit liked to now they're like, we love the Jews. It's almost like, I hate to go political again, but I'm going to. After the October attack of last year on Israel, how half our politicians all of a sudden were wearing little Jewish flags on their lapels, just like they did for the other wars going on. And then all of a sudden it became not politically popular to do that, and then they all went away. Let's continue on, verse 17. In every province and the city wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. And here's where we were going to end, but we're going to keep going. Chapter 9. So on March 7th, the two decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them, but no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. Previously, when we were talking about who were all the nobles scared of? Haman. But now they're scared of Mordecai. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa itself, the Jews killed 500 men. They also killed, and I'm going to butcher these names, so I'm going to skip ahead, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not take any plunder. So to all our Sunday school teachers out there, and to anybody reading the Bible, it is not just you who has issues with Old Testament names sometimes. Verse 11, that very day when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther. He said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they have done that here, what has happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I will do it. Esther responded, if it pleases the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do it again tomorrow, as they have done today. And this gets a little morbid. And let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. They were shish kebabbed along with their dad. You know, one of the things that's interesting as we think about this, when we think about big signs and warnings, that this was supposed to serve as a warning to everybody in Susa, around the provinces, to not mess with the Jews or this will happen to you. I was thinking this morning, this is kind of like in movies that we see of the Old West, when somebody was hanged and they kind of just left them hanging there when you came into town. And a lot of times the crimes of whatever they had done would be put above their head as a warning to those of, don't do this. I'm going to say this anyway. Capital punishment is intended to serve as a warning to not do these things. Goes back to, well, is this bad or is this good? We see all throughout the Bible, some people would argue this is bad, that actions have consequences. And some actions have way more severe consequences. Get back into the Old Testament Mosaic law. An eye for an eye, ear for an ear, on and on and on. If you murder somebody, according to Mosaic law, you yourself should be offed. But could you imagine going and seeing that as somebody who is just willy-nilly a citizen of Susa who is not Jewish? What would you be thinking at that point? Because it was not that they were put up and shish kebabbed in a little lowly back corner. They were put somewhere prominently to serve as a warning to the people, do not go after these people or this will happen to you. It's the same reason why across America, we used to have capital punishment for murder, and it was a public spectacle. I mean, the Wild West wasn't just the last time they had public hangings, because why? They wanted people to know, if you do this, this will happen to you. And I'm about to say something else political. We see where it goes when you don't follow the laws of the land that were put in place. When you don't prosecute people the way you should, according to the laws of the land. What happens? People think anything goes. When the law is not upheld, everybody suffers. Verse 14, so the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. Then the Jews at Susa gathered together on March 8th and killed 300 more men, and again they took no plunder. Meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together to defend their lives. They gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not take any plunder. This was done throughout the provinces on March 7th and March 8th. They rested, celebrating their victories with the day of feasting and gladness. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7th and again on March 8th and rested on March 9th, making that their day of feasting and gladness. So to this day, rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and holiday on the appointed day in the late winter, when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other. We're going to finish this out next week, the last chapter 9 and chapter 10. But one of the things that I want us to see, and I've been hoping that we would see throughout all of Esther, is that what is different this time for the Jewish people? Who did they cling onto this time? God. In all their previous history, from the time of Joshua into the judges, into the time of the kings, what did the Jewish people do? The best way, when we went through our series in Judges 2 years ago, was the exact way that the book of Judges says it. And the people of Israel whored after other gods, not Jehovah. They're like, we like this, we want to do this. And so what happened? God handed them over for punishment until the time was nigh to where the people of Israel cried out. They said, God, we're sorry, come redeem us. But this time, the attack from outside was coming first. And what was the first thing that the people of God did? They got down on their knees and they prayed. Many of them put on sackcloth and ashes on their head to not only do prayer, that sounds really bad. To not only pray, but they wanted to do exactly everything according to the Mosaic law to show that they were praying, they were fasting, they were calling out to God. Because one of the things that happened in Israel's historical life is the time of exile changed them forever. Because before exile, we see them going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Worship God, worship someone else, worship God, worship something else. But they had to go through exile to finally figure out if they would worship God as God or if they would keep bowing the knee to other idols. We see in Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what did they refuse to do? Bow down to the statue. We see later on in Daniel with Daniel himself, don't pray to anybody but the king. What did Daniel did? I'm going to keep on worshiping. One of the things that we can take away from all of this is sometimes, though we like it or not, we have to go through trials and hard times for God to make us better on the other side of it. Now, do we like the trials? Not one bit. But are we better on the other side? Yeah. We hear verses all the time, as iron sharpens iron, so does one brother sharpen another. But I want us to think about it like this morning. How many of you have ever sharpened a knife? Anybody? Now, is it really easy to dull a knife? Yeah. What's interesting with knives is if you take a knife and you start scraping it on a bad rock, what happens to it? It becomes really dull. But yet at the same time, if you have the right kind of sharpening stones, what can it do to that knife? It can make it super sharp. It can make a perfect edge. You can straighten it, and it's better. But what happens sometimes if we try to do things on our own? Does it work the way it needs to? No. As I've learned playing and sharpening with knives over the years, I really love the push test on a piece of paper. Now, if you have a really bad knife and you try to cut a piece of paper, do you think it's easy or hard? It's really hard, and you have to put so much more energy, and you kind of try to whack the paper. I'm a righty, so I'd go like this. I'm not purposely acting like I'm cutting the Bible, just for reference for anybody. But I mean, you have to push and nothing happens. But after a knife has been refined, after it has been sharpened, after it's been abused essentially on another rock that's good for it, you can just start dropping the knife, and what does the knife do to the paper? It goes smoothly all the way through. And one of the most interesting things, and I didn't get this till I was older, is which is actually more dangerous when you're using it, a dull knife or a sharp knife? A dull knife. Because you have to put so much more effort into it, you have to try, but if you don't have the right tools and the right equipment, what's going to happen? Bad things. That's how people lose fingers. But a sharp knife takes so much effort, it takes so much less time, just everything works. But what did it have to go through to get to that point to where it could be useful? It had to be rubbed up against a right stone that in most of our minds would be like, why does this even work? Even me, I'm like, how does one stone work and one stone doesn't? There's the whole science thing, and that's above my thing. I have the wrong kind of degrees for that. But what's the biggest thing that it takes to get a perfectly sharp knife for those of you who know? You have to know what you're doing, but it also takes time and patience. What is the worst thing that I've said over and over and over again you can ever pray for? Patience. You know why? Because God doesn't just give you patience. He puts situations in your lives and tests in your lives that get you to be patient. You don't just automatically wake up one day and pray about it and be like, I'm the most patient person ever. A lot of times you have to go through things that push your limits to where you're like, I just want to give up. And then one day you're like, oh, this didn't bother me anymore. Or that didn't bother me anymore. But for Israel, when they came back to Jerusalem, when they went back into the land, as they started building the walls, before they built the temple, one of the first things that they did was they opened the book of the law and they read it to the people. Going way back to Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham. I will be your God and you will be my people. But the caveat with that is that God would always be their God, but for him to take care of them like he could, they had to worship him and him alone. You know, there's a lot of if-then statements in the Bible. If you do this, God will do this. But many times, who does that if statement start with? Us. Because if-then statements are conditional. It's on the condition that we have to do things. Which sometimes conditional statements are inconvenient. But for us to become who God wants us to be, sometimes he has to take us through hard things. What we're going to look at next week as we finish out Esther next week is the Jews have a habit in their history, and once again, of setting up festivals to remember the goodness of God in their lives. Why? Because if you don't make sure that you try to remember things, how easily do we forget things? If I don't write things down many times, I forget it. Anybody else? Yep. That's why my calendar has a calendar. I have like 3 different calendars. I'm like Clara. I'm like, wait, how many? 3 different calendars. So that we remember. Just like for us as Christians, why do we celebrate Good Friday? Because we remember the day that Christ gave his all for us. And it's the best if-then statement in the entire Bible. If you call upon the name of the Lord, you will be saved. That's what the Jewish people did here in Esther. They cried out to God for salvation, and he brought it to them. Because people were willing to step up. And first, they did exactly what God told them to do when things like this happen. But second, they were willing to step up into the moment to what God was calling them specifically to. Now, the best thing for each and every single person here and every single person around the world is that we can be saved if we call on the name of Jesus Christ.